Welcome back to Chess Tactic Today. In round 2 of the FIDE World Cup 2025, young Indian chess grandmaster and the reigning world chess champion Gukesh D faces Kazakhstan's rising star Kazybek Nogerbek, and this game turns into a strategic war straight out of the Caro-Kann defense. What starts as calm positional play soon erupts into deep tactics, bold pawn breaks, and masterful maneuvering from both sides. It's brains, precision, and pure fighting spirit World Cup chess at its finest. And here we go, Nogerbek opens with pawn to f4, the king's pawn opening, immediately staking a claim in the center of the board. This is the most popular and ambitious first move in chess. In response, Gukesh chooses the Caro-Kann defense with pawn to c6. This is a rock-solid, reliable opening. Black is saying, I'm not going to let you run me over. I'm building a fortress first and will challenge the center on my own terms. White naturally follows up with pawn to d4, creating that classic perfect pawn center. This is the ideal scenario for white early on, controlling the key central squares. And here's black's counterpunch. Pawn to d5 immediately challenges white's central control. This is the whole point of the Caro-Kann: prepare c6, then strike with d5. Nogerbek decides on the exchange variation, capturing the pawn on d5. This relieves the central tension right away, leading to a more strategic and positional game rather than a wild tactical brawl. Gukesh recaptures, and we have a very symmetrical pawn structure. Now the game will be about subtle piece placement and long-term plans. White develops the light-squared bishop to d3. This is a perfect square for it, eyeing the kingside and putting a stop to any tricky, f5 ideas from black for now. Black develops the knight to c6, adding another defender to the d5 pawn and preparing to control more of the center. A quiet but essential move. White plays pawn to c3, reinforcing the d4 pawn and taking away the b4 square from black's knight, a very solidifying move. Gukesh develops his queen to c7. This is a multi-purpose move. It protects the f5 square, connects the rooks later on, and prepares to challenge white's control of the center. A very useful prophylactic move. Pawn to h3 prevents black from pinning the f3 knight with bg4, which can be a major annoyance. White is keeping his position clean and flexible. Black plays pawn to e6, creating a solid pawn chain and preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop. The position is still very balanced. Knight to f3, the most natural developing move on the board. White controls the center and prepares to castle the king to safety. And black mirrors the development with bishop to d6. This is a great square, putting pressure on white's kingside and preparing to castle as well. White castles kingside. The king is now tucked away safely, and the rook is ready to join the fight on the e-file. An interesting choice from Gukesh. Knight to e7 is a very flexible developing move. It supports the d5 pawn and keeps the option open to jump to g6 or f5 later in the game. White immediately puts the rook on the e-file with Rion. This is a standard plan, preparing to fight for control of the only semi-open file. Gukesh follows suit, castling kingside. Both players have completed their initial development, and now the middle game is truly about to begin. This is where the strategic battle heats up. White plays pawn to b3, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop to a3 or beat woe. This move signals white's intention to challenge black's control of the long diagonal. A subtle pawn move from black, preparing to expand on the queenside with b5 later. It also gives the b7 pawn a defender. And there's the idea, bishop to a3. White wants to trade off black's strong bishop on d6. This is a common strategy to weaken the opponent's control of key light squares. Gukesh moves his knight to g6, repositioning it to a more active square where it eyes f4 and h4. He's not afraid of the bishop trade. White goes ahead with the plan, bishop takes bishop on d6. And Gukesh recaptures with the queen. The queen is now more centralized, and black's position remains very solid. Another trade, white's bishop takes the knight on g6. Nogerbek is willing to give up the bishop pair to damage black's pawn structure. This is a double-edged decision. Black recaptures and now has doubled pawns on the g-file. While this can sometimes be a weakness, it also gives black extra control over the f5 square and opens the h-file for the rook, a fascinating strategic trade-off. This is a key moment in the game. White's knight jumps into the fantastic f5 outpost. This piece is a real powerhouse here. It restricts black's pieces, puts pressure on the kingside, and is very difficult to kick out. The battle for control of this square will define the next phase of the game. Gukesh calmly repositions his knight to e7. He's preparing to challenge White's outpost knight and untangle his own pieces. A patient and professional response. An aggressive move from White, pawn to h4, tries to create kingside weaknesses and fix Black's g6 pawn as a target. But remember, every pawn move creates a weakness of its own. And Gukesh immediately challenges the knight. Pawn to f6 forces the f5 knight to move, but it does slightly weaken the light squares around Black's king. The tension is rising. The knight retreats to d3, where it's still very useful, ready to jump back into the action via f4 or b4. Black develops the bishop to d7, connecting the rooks and preparing to fight for control of the c-file. White develops his last minor piece, knight to d12. All the pieces are now in the game. It feels like we're in the calm before the storm. Gukesh brings his rook to the c-file. The c-file is the main highway for the heavy pieces in this position, and both sides are starting to mass their forces there. And White does the same, rook to cone. We have a classic strategic standoff on the c-file. Who will blink first? Black prepares to double rooks with rook to c7. This is a powerful idea you can use in your own games. Doubling rooks on an open file puts immense pressure on your opponent. White's knight reroutes to f3, adding another defender to the kingside and preparing to challenge Black's control of the center. And there it is, Black completes the battery on the c-file. Now White has to be extremely careful about any weaknesses on that side of the board. The queen moves to d12, a solid central square where it keeps an eye on everything and connects White's rooks. A subtle but brilliant repositioning. The bishop moves to e8, getting out of the way of the rooks and preparing to swing over to f7 to defend the king. White plays pawn to g3. This move takes away the f4 square from Black's knight, but it also creates some long-term light square weaknesses around the White king, a risky decision. And the bishop lands on f7 just as planned. It's now a fantastic defensive piece, protecting the king and eyeing the long diagonal. A slow king move to g12. White is likely trying to get the king off the back rank and prepare to use the h-file rook. Gukesh's knight lands on the f5 square, a beautiful outpost where it puts pressure on White's kingside. Black's pieces are starting to look very active. White doubles rooks on the e-file, but it seems less threatening than Black's control of the c-file. And now Gukesh starts a second front. Pawn to a5 begins a queenside expansion, forcing White to divide his attention. This is a classic strategy. When you have an advantage, open up another part of the board. The queen shuffles back to e1. White is trying to hold everything together, but Black is the one asking all the questions. The rook lifts to c6, a flexible move preparing to swing over to the queenside or support a central break. White adjusts his rook formation, preparing to defend against Black's growing queenside pressure. Another solidifying pawn move, pawn to b6, preparing to push, b5 and crack open White's queenside. The queen returns to d12. White is maneuvering, but it's hard to find a concrete plan. Gukesh is slowly tightening the screws. The Black queen moves to c7, putting more pressure down the c-file and eyeing the Fivian diagonal. The pieces are all coordinating beautifully. White's knight jumps to f4, a more active square where it challenges Black's control of the center, but it also leaves the d3 square. And here comes the pawn break. Pawn to b5 cracks open the queenside. Black is now fighting on all fronts and White is stretched thin. The knight returns to d3, trying to shore up the queenside defenses. Gukesh's knight on e7 repositions to d6. Look at the harmony of Black's pieces. Every piece has a purpose and they are all working towards the same goal. White shuffles the queen again, trying to find a setup that can withstand the pressure. The knight jumps back to f5, putting pressure on the White queen and kingside. Gukesh is probing for weaknesses. And the queen moves back to d12. We see some repetition, but Black is the one making progress. Knight to d6 again. Gukesh isn't in a hurry. He's improving his position with each move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. White continues to shuffle. It's clear that Nogerbek is on the defensive, trying to react to Black's plans. A fantastic move. The queen swings over to a7, preparing to invade on the queenside. This move completely changes the dynamic of the position. White's knight lands on c5. This looks like a powerful move, blocking the c-file and creating threats. But watch closely, because this is the moment the real fireworks begin. Boom, there it is, the move of the game. Just when it looked like white had stabilized, Gukesh blows the center wide open with the stunning pawn sacrifice. Effiv, this move is brilliant because it activates all of his pieces, creates a powerful passed pawn, and exposes the white king. A masterstroke of positional understanding. White tries to lock down the queenside with pawn to b4, but the damage in the center has already been done. The initiative is firmly in black's hands now. The pawn marches forward to f4. This pawn is an absolute monster. It splits white's position in two and creates a permanent weakness in the white camp. White moves the knight to h2, trying to get it back into the game, but it's too passive. Black's pieces are flooding into the newly opened lines. And black's knight takes up a commanding post on c4. It attacks the queen and controls key squares. White's position is collapsing. The queen is forced to retreat to e2. White is in full survival mode. The other knight joins the party, knight to a3, threatening to wreak havoc on the queenside. The coordination of black's pieces is simply world-class. White's rook moves to b2 to defend, but this is a very passive square. Black is completely dominating the board. The knight returns to c4, repeating the threat. Gukesh is enjoying himself, showing his complete control over the position. The rook shuffles back. White is just trying to hold on, but there are too many threats to deal with. Gukesh now advances on the kingside with pawn to f5, taking away the f4 square from white's knight and preparing to create even more threats. A desperate attempt by white. Pawn to f4 tries to block the kingside, but this move creates new weaknesses and is ultimately a sign of resignation. Black takes on b4, opening up the file for the rooks. Another line of attack is now available. White recaptures, but now the b-pawn is a weakness and the file is black's highway. The queen immediately swings over to a3, putting immense pressure on white's weak pawns. The attack is relentless. The knight on h2 finally reroutes to phone, but it's far too late. It's a spectator to the destruction. And there's the reward. Queen takes the pawn on b4. After all that brilliant strategic play, Gukesh now has a material advantage to go along with his overwhelming positional dominance. It's just a matter of technique from here. White's queen tries to create some counterplay, but black's position is too solid. The rook swings over to the file. The final phase of the attack is beginning. White tries to defend, but the defenses are crumbling. The queen repositions, keeping the pressure on and preparing to create more threats. More shuffling from white's rooks. It's a grim picture for Nogerbek. Gukesh's queen moves back to date. He is regrouping his forces for the final, decisive blow. There is no rush. White's knight moves to b3, trying to create some sort of blockade, but it's a futile effort. The rooks double on the file. The pressure is unbearable. White's rook moves, but it's hard to see what it's accomplishing. Black is in complete control. And now the b-pawn starts to roll. Another passed pawn is on its way, stretching white's defenses to the breaking point. White's rooks are tied down to defensive duties. They have no active prospects. The bishop repositions to e8, preparing to join the attack on the queenside. Every piece is working in perfect harmony. The queen moves, but white is running out of useful moves. The queen finds another perfect square on b6, putting pressure on white's d4 pawn and controlling key diagonals. The rook moves to f2, but the action is all on the other side of the board. The rook infiltrates to a3. White's position is now completely lost. White's knight jumps to e3, a last-ditch effort to create complications. Gukesh simplifies trading knights. When you're winning, trading pieces is almost always a good idea. White recaptures, but now black's bishop is ready to enter the game with decisive effect. And there it is, bishop to b5, a crushing move that pins the d3 knight and puts even more pressure on white's fragile position. The rook moves to b2, but it cannot solve white's fundamental problems. The bishop moves to d3, completely paralyzing white's queenside, a beautiful demonstration of the power of the bishop pair. The queen is forced to a passive square. White is just waiting for the end. The queen repositions again, tightening the net. The end is near. The king moves to h2, a sad admission that there are no good moves left. The queen attacks the d4 pawn. Gukesh is mopping up. The queen defends, but it's only a temporary solution. The queen moves to c3, a dominant square where it controls everything. White offers a queen trade, but this would lead to a hopelessly lost endgame for white. Gukesh is in no mood to trade. Bishop to c4 keeps all the pressure on and prepares for the final push. The queen retreats, white is completely tied up in knots. And here is the final nail in the coffin. That monster pawn from move 32 marches forward to e3. This is a devastating blow. It attacks the f2 rook and prepares to promote. White's position completely collapses after this move. What a journey for that little pawn. The rook moves, desperately trying to create a defense, but it's all over. The pawn pushes again, pawn to e2. It's now just one square away from becoming a new queen. This forces White's hand and leads to a beautiful finishing blow. White has to give up the rook for the pawn, but this is the beginning of the end. Black recaptures the rook. Now White is down significant material. White recaptures the bishop, but look closely. Gukesh has one final, brilliant surprise. The knockout punch, queen takes rook on b2, an absolutely stunning queen sacrifice to finish the game. After White recaptures with qx b2, Black will play rx b2, and there is no defense against the coming threats. A breathtaking conclusion to a strategic masterpiece. And with that, Nogerbek resigns. What a spectacular performance by Gukesh D. From the solid Caro-Kann to that game-changing f5 pawn break, this was a masterclass in strategy and execution. Thanks for joining us on Chess Tactic today, and we'll see you for the next brilliant game.